Modern monetary theory has gotten a lot of attention among mainstream economists, though most remain puzzled by its propositions. Let's see if we can make sense of them. At the core of MMT lies an understanding of money and from where it gets its value. Most nations which issue their own currency, like the United States, have a system of fiat money. The Treasury does not exchange the US dollar for gold or any other commodity. Its value, according to MMT proponents, is that it can be used to pay taxes. This view, which is called chartalism and has been around a long time, isn't particularly controversial. But MMT proponents say that it means the government doesn't face any financial constraints. No matter how high the national debt gets, the US will always, and I mean always, be able to pay it. And that is because it has a monopoly over US currency. It can just print more and use it to pay the debt. This claim is a little vexing, but it isn't wrong. Even the conservative former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, agrees. He said to Congress, "The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default." This is important when it comes to situations like the one Greece faced in the 2010s, where it was no longer able to pay its debts. Greece is part of the euro, a currency union that many European nations have adopted, which means that Greece could not just print more euros when the bills came due, as the US can. MMT proponents also point to other nations like Japan to show that debt levels can go much, much higher than US levels and not be a problem at all. The debt to GDP ratio in Japan has been rising since the 1990s and is around 200% of GDP now. And this is just debt held by the central government. And despite printing lots of yen over this period, the Japanese economy has experienced very little inflation. Just as the modern monetary theorists say, there does not seem to be a financial constraint on governments that issue their own currency. Borrowing money to pay for spending just isn't a problem. So where do MMT proponents draw the line? Certainly they don't think we can just print infinite money without any worry. Indeed, much of their theory just seems to be a paradigm shift in how we think about government budgeting. According to them, having the government borrow and pay back money is just a monetary policy device. We could skip that step if we wanted and just print the money the government spends, no borrowing required. The limit on that spending, then, is inflation. Government spending, or deficit spending under our normal paradigm, pushes the economy towards full employment. But once we're at full employment, then additional money creation will begin to accelerate inflation. I'll be honest, it's hard to pin down what modern monetary theory is claiming. In one interpretation, the government can spend freely and use taxes to make sure inflation does not spiral out of control. Many proponents point to government finance in medieval times when kings would create money to spend and then set a tax equal to the amount of their spending. When the tax revenue came in, they burned the money. In that way, government spending created money and taxes destroyed it. They envision a similar framework for government spending today, where we no longer evaluate the impact policies have on the budget, but rather we evaluate whether or not they will cause inflation. Still others suggest that inflation just isn't that big of a concern because government spending will not be anywhere near the level needed to push us past full employment, though this is much harder to swallow. In the end, a lot of modern monetary theory feels like it's just trying to shroud a desire for expensive government programs with an intellectual reason not to worry about the additional spending needed to make it happen. It conjures to mind the quote of John Maynard Keynes that many who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. And indeed, most economists agree that this framework is a recipe for hyperinflation if governments cannot rein in their spending. But I do think there is one important point here worth heeding. In the United States, we have a legal debt limit. This is an arbitrary limit set by Congress which prohibits the U.S. Treasury from borrowing more than a certain amount. Almost everyone is able to recognize how absurd this law is, which basically prohibits the Treasury from paying the bills Congress decides to rack up. Modern monetary theory argues that the value of our fiat money comes from government debt. And economists agree that this debt forms the backbone of the U.S. economy. We also agree that it is literally impossible for the U.S. to default on its debt, unless the U.S. decides to default when it doesn't have to. That's the risk the debt limit imposes on us. Should Congress ever fail to raise the limit, which it has perilously been close to several times now, the Treasury would be forced to default on U.S. debt despite an ability to pay. To say that the result would be catastrophic would be an understatement, and if modern monetary theorists are to be believed, it could undermine the entire monetary system, bringing the whole thing down. Thankfully, there are some audacious proposals, such as minting a $1 trillion coin that might stave off disaster should we ever invite it upon ourselves. But if you have been wondering what sort of thing could cause another financial crisis like the one we saw in 2008, this could do it.